Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf, Quarantine Edition. I am really excited today because I am finally embarking on an exploration of an author's oeuvre that has interested me for a long time now. That author is Alexander Theroux, and I'm going to be talking about his very first published novel, 3 Wogs, today. I've acquired a lot of his books. I still have a couple on the way. Of course, Darconville's Cat is probably the most widely known of the people who know about Alexander Theroux, that is. It could definitely be said that he is off the radar, and it seems like his repertoire is divided between old Theroux and then newer Theroux, with most of even his diehard fans leaning more towards the older stuff. But nonetheless, the very first 2 publications, in fact, or first 2 novels, I should say, because he said fables and stuff published in between, and published a lot of short stories while in university and so on. But his first 2 are 3 Wogs and then Darconville's Cat. Darconville's Cat, I'm determined, you've heard me talk about in other videos, that I know enough already to know how much I'm going to love it, so I want to save it. I'm that type of person who at Christmas or on my birthday, I want to save that best present for the absolute last. I also have An Adultery, another novel of his, and then his biggest novel since Darconville's Cat, Laura Warholic, his 2 essay collections, The Primary Colors and The Secondary Colors. I saw that the very first one in The Primary Colors is on blue. So I'm excited to, when I get to the essay on blue, to compare it to On Being Blue, William Gass. And then there are these publications. Laura Warholic is also from Fantagraphics books, but then there are also these publications of these idiosyncratic essays. Einstein's Beats. You've heard me talk about this one in some other videos. I have picked through this here and there to read of some curious food phobias from different celebrities and so on. I have yet to read it all the way through, but then there's also The Grammar of Rock and Estonia. All these 2 books, The Grammar of Rock and Estonia, from what I've seen of reviewers, which, you know, I take every review that I see on Amazon and Goodreads, unless it's from a reputable source, with a grain of salt, a heavy dose of salt. But it seems like there's a lot of confusion regarding what these books are. From what I can tell with Estonia, for example, it seems like people were expecting a hardcore travel guide or something that's fact-checked by a team of fact-checkers or something, but the subtitle says a ramble through the periphery. So I think that kind of hints at what it really is, more personal in nature. This is me from the future. I now have the collected poems by Fantagraphics and this amazing essay. 3 Wogs. It's a novel in the form of a triptych. And it chronicles the xenophobia, the racism of 1960s and 1970s Britain. This is really bold as a first novel. You know, even for 1972, this is really bold. I mean, the title alone is forcing me to use a British racial slur, Wog, which means basically anybody who's not white and British. I hope it goes without saying that I am in fact not a racist in any measure. It's bold not only because it uses, you know, a slur right here in the title, even though it is, you know, as we'll find, this is satire. It's also bold because it's written by an American about all these British people who are reprehensible racists. And in fact, it seems that when he finished his PhD at the University of Virginia, he went to England for a while, during which time he accepted a Fulbright grant. And apparently while he was there, he absorbed all of the local color, as it were. And it's amazing to see the level at which Theroux makes this such a British book. He also did study British literature, older British literature, that is, at UVA, 17th century British lit. But all of the idioms and the dialect, all of the things that are on people's minds, comes into play here and is wrought so well that you'll swear he's a British author. Just from the very first book, it really puts me in the mind of William Gass and David Foster Wallace, among many others, of course. But William Gass, just his Theroux's way with words and imagery, it did remind me of my times of reading In the Heart of the Country and then The Tunnel. But then also it had this David Foster Wallace feel of the hyper erudition blended with a comic narrative. So just exhausting something that's very commonplace, but with a degree of erudition and intellect and a feeling for language, that it just creates this bliss, like this bliss as Roland Barthes would have it. For example, on page 69, this is the character Childe Rowland looking at a wall of graffiti, and it says this: "An underground wall is invariably the Rosetta Stone of the troglodyte." I mean, already, how beautiful is that? An underground wall is invariably the Rosetta Stone of the troglodyte. Rowland skated his eyes over the surface of the wall, which was scored with calligraphies barbed and illiterate. It was as full as the personal page in the London Times. Pansexual suggestions, telephone numbers, trysts, preferences. A sprightly, if vile, series of anatomical studies done in indelible lipstick. Single familiar verbs, nouns, adjectives, spaced out alone. An omeletted reproduction of the Union Jack. The vivid declaration by Edwin of eternal affection for Angelina crossed out to question mark, crossed out to what read like the entire male population from Giggleswick to the lower Americas. Unmetrical limericks, lavatorial allusions accompanied with hieroglyphs, predominantly tumescent. Lovers' names ballooned in asymmetrical hearts, pierced through with shaky arrows. And finally, in bright chalks, the socio-political proclamations of the chthonic historian burdened with unscrolling his views on immigration and ethnic balance, which tripped in large semi-unicale slants through descending letters to frantic exclamation. So I hope you can see what I mean there. It's got this David Foster Wallace feel to it, but at the same time, it made me think of Gass and Wallace, among others. But on both counts, really on all counts, Theroux is entirely something his own. Again, the structure of this novel is that of a triptych, where the outer panels are a little bit smaller. They're each about 50 pages. And then the middle panel is the largest. That is Childe Rowland, and a triptych was made like that so that it could fold up. The outer panels could fold onto the middle panel. Each panel has a predominant color corresponding to the race of its wog in question. So in Miss Proby Gets Hers, or Mrs. Proby Gets Hers, there's a preoccupation with yellow, and you'll see this as you read it. Yellow is everywhere. And this is exactly psychologically how Miss Proby sees the world through her racist lens. Likewise, Rowland in the middle panel of the triptych is their browns permeate. And then finally, with the wife of God, the Reverend Witch Therefore, but more so in that one, his mother, the Lady Therefore, her world is painted in black. Well, actually, they both are, but two completely different sentiments and drives behind why the mother's world is seen in black and the son's world is seen in black. In fact, the image of the triptych is brought into the last story near the end. It says, "The priest summoned the altar boys to his side and, with a sweep of impatience, brushed quickly past them toward the altar steps, where they then hinged together in a triptych." It's actually more traditional storytelling here. It's very linear. There are no complicated tricks and hijinks with perspective or time like we get in, say, Pynchon. You'll never say what's going on here, although you may say, what in the world does that word mean? There's enough context and heavy plot to where it's really like reading a traditional story. It is relentlessly literary. It rewards many times over those of us who have studied in the humanities, who have studied literature, art, philosophy, history. It's saturated with rhetorical devices and literary allusions and neologisms. Obscurities abound. Words are everywhere. Theroux loves words. He's definitely a dictionary reader, like Foster Wallace was, like Jim Gower has talked about that he is. In the first two stories, I was doing what I normally do and jotting down all of the words I didn't know already on the title page. But by the third story, I finally gave up doing that, and I just marked them in the margins to come back. But despite all of the amazing gymnastics that are done with language, with words here, I still understood what was going on even without having to look each word up over and over. He gives us, again, enough to know what's going on. And really, part of the pleasure of reading Theroux, at least in 3 Wogs, was that experience of having to look up the words. Because almost every time I looked up a word, and I had that context fresh in mind, seeing how perfectly the definition of the word fit the way in which Theroux used it was part of the pleasure of the reading experience. One of my favorite words, for example, comes when it's talking about this orator, or this amateur orator, who is rhapsodizing through his seething xenophobia from a soapbox, and it says something about how his oratory is not being very Marco Aurelian. And finally, Theroux is the master of the unflattering physical description of his characters. Like I said, this is a bold first choice for a book as an American writing about these reprehensible British characters, their terrible racism. It is, however, satire. It's comic. But as always in satire, it's comical. Everything's pushed to the absurd, but it's got this dark underbelly of truth. And Theroux cleverly shows that the Brits and the Wogs, as they term them, are really not that different at all. In fact, it flips the script a couple of times. He also exposes how a lot of this ostensible racism, xenophobia, is actually expressing the underlying resentment and bitterness at having lost the imperial status of the world. In the first story, Mrs. Proby gets hers. Mrs. Proby's inherited racism is brought into conflict with Mr. Fun, a Chinese merchant who ends up living in her neighborhood. That's pivotal. It shows how her inherited racism from her culture comes into conflict with Mr. Fun's inherited misogyny from his father, with deadly consequences. The ending is a repetition of the opening from a different perspective, and it makes a very poignant statement. Often in here, other people, or like people who are different, they aren't the only objects modified by human emotions. Inanimate objects are also constantly personified. And it shows how our emotive drives and our inherited resentments and prejudices can really filter everything, whether animate or not. The writing, again, is so good that it often overshadows the subject matter. For example, "I'm doing nicely, thank you," answered Mrs. Cullinane, whose character was basically that of blotting paper, passive, receptive, and ready for the strangest of Rorschachs, notwithstanding those patterns of peculiarity soaked up by the thrust and imposition of Mrs. Proby's iron will and irrevocable opinion. I love this. It says, "The Bunch of Grapes was an old pub rebuilt in the 19th century, but evocative of Dickensian solidarity and cheer. Wooden beams, smoked windows cut fine with curling designs, red walls, rubbed brass rails, and a long bar in the shape of a rhomboid upon which sat a phalanx of clotted sauce bottles." In the middle story, Childe Rowland, he is a homeless, racist youth, and he puts Dilip, an immigrant from India who's here studying electronic engineering, in his sights. But the ending is a lot different this time. This story actually ratchets up Theroux's unique prose style, saturated as it is with this relentless literariness. It's almost like the Mrs. Proby is a start, like a primer for what Theroux is trying to do with his prose. And then in the second one, he ratchets it up, and then in the third one, he puts it into hyperdrive. The opening and closing are that of a fairy tale. It opens with Once Upon a Time and closes with Happily Ever After. Again, like the first one, there's this extremely poignant ending with this image of Rowland trying to wipe this dark smudge off of the bus, and then getting frustrated, but then realizing that he can't do it, that it is there to stay, and he must accept it. Rowland, he views the world largely as a game of football. He's constantly in his mind looking at things around him, and putting himself in the mind of a footballer who's, trying to score a goal and dominate the opponent and so on. And the only reason, comically, the only reason he can give Dillop for why Britain is so great is that it's easy to get cigarettes. And we find that Rowland starts to realize that Dillop knows quite a lot about things, even if he isn't able to express himself with the eloquence of a native English speaker. And it puts Rowland in this defensive mode where he's realizing that he doesn't know as much or doesn't have as much insight as Dillop. And this is where the walls start breaking down for him. Again, the writing is outstanding. This is the Pakistani ice cream truck worker who's getting ready to use a hand chime to alert people that the ice cream truck is coming around. And it says, he came to recognize life only when he tried to catch the attention of the immediate world, which he did, occasionally, with a mechanical and soullessly unreflective shake of his bells, a tinnitus of frightfully unmelodic and leaden binks that resembled more than anything else the dead rattle of a sea shingle. And here is a great use of anastrophe. He remained uneventfully in the grip of a certain devil, restlessness. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the result of that arbitrary, furiously ill-defined goad which higgledy-piggledy sent the Dutchman flying, the Jew wandering, the mariner rhyming. And finally, in the last story, which is sublime, everything I love from so many authors. It reminded me of Gaddis. It reminded me of Ducournay. It reminded me of Foster Wallace. It reminded me of Gass. But it's called The Wife of God. And in here, the Reverend Witch, therefore, tries to dissuade a union of miscegenation. But it's way more complicated than that, as we'll come to see from the Freudian opening lines and Reverend Witch's behavior around the African groom-to-be Cyril. We start to understand that Witch's preferences on multiple levels go quite against that of his mother's. His mother is looking backwards toward a grander time in English history, obviously in time when the only people around her were her own type of people, but her son, for all of her trying to define his world and confine his world to be that of her nostalgia, or her nostalgic idyll of England, he has quite different inclinations. As his name and his mother's name entail, language and grammar are really brought to the surface in this one. His name alone, the Reverend Witch, therefore, character who is composed of an adjective, as Theroux tells us in his epigram. It's his own epigram in the beginning of this one, and the epigram says, Reverend is not a title, it is an adjective set before a proper name, and perhaps not even one all that proper. So we see that this character is composed of an adjective, a pronoun, but sometimes an adjective, and then a conjunctive adverb. And similarly, the narrative itself brings in grammar such as, "This is beastly inconvenient, you being late, if you must know, mother," and to actually be amused by it all. He split the infinitive deliberately. She paused, then with a glare through a cribriform veil she had just pulled over her face, she enunciated crisply, "Please, however," which, Reverend Witch, saw the danger signal of the conjunctive adverb and the load it carried coming into view. "Shut up." And you'll have to kind of see how it's written out to really get the full effect of that. But that is to say that, Theroux is really making us aware at this point that, the characters, the story, everything is a construct of language. The racist theme in here, which it's still present, is actually sort of relegated, and the religious mania is brought to the fore, and especially that of Catholicism. And with that, we get a litany of very amusing patron saints, including the patron saint of those who suffer from uterine nostalgia. The ending is brilliant. There's this great use of anaphora, this repetition of "oh where" and "when again" and "had they gone forever, why nevermore," over and over, with Lady therefore lamenting the fact that her old golden age of England is gone. But then that stands in stark contrast to "which therefore," and we see these words in his closing paragraph, words like remorseless darkness, which is maybe perhaps a triple entendre at this point, and helpless and lost and blackness, alone to himself. He's in this existential stasis, where it's defining a generation that does not have any longing for the past, that it finds reprehensible and limiting, but also no hope for the future either. So my first foray into Theroux was a huge success. It confirmed my suspicions that this is an author whom I will cherish for a long time and revisit. The richness of language and the passion for words is in hyperdrive in these stories, and I cannot wait to explore more of his repertoire.